Now, I'm really honoured today to speak to the brilliant Peter Beinart, who has written a fantastic book called Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. You can see I read it because I've got it's like covered in tea stains, which is always I think, a positive sign of at least having
Very,
engaged with your brilliant work.
very British of you. Yeah.
I could not be more British. Sometimes it's embarrassing.
Right.
Let's not start talking about tea and the queuing system. Yeah, Peter is the author of the Beinart Notebook on Substack, which you should all go and check out, as well as editor-at-large at Jewish Currents. There's so much in this book. It's such a, I would say, full of, huge. Well, it's a scholarly book. It's quite a, I don't know. It's quite a searing read in lots of ways. It's scholarly, obviously has this historical and theological context, but it's obviously a very personal, by definition, book. Just want to ask, I mean, firstly, why, in terms of the book you've written, and it very much, it's you kind of talk about the sense of Jewishness as being like a family, and there's this schism within that family, and you're, as someone who's been very vocal and courageously vocal against the horrors in Gaza, speaking to those in that family who will now refuse even maybe to speak to you, kind of thing. So just tell me, why have you written this book? What's the purpose of this book, and why now?
I think I've had for many years this fear that the relationship that the organized Jewish community in the United States and many other parts of the world had towards Israel meant that we would never say enough, that there was an unconditional element to organized Jewish support for the state of Israel, which is really, which would mean that there would be nothing Israel could do that we would say this and no further. We will now withdraw our support for these actions. And in a way, that's what I started to see over the last year and a half or so. After the horror of October 7th, it became really clear to me very quickly that basically almost no matter what Israel did in Gaza, people would justify it, people in power in our community. And I watched day in and day out, you I'm sure maybe had a similar experience of just unfolding horror that often just took my breath away, the scope of it. And looking at the organized American Jewish community, I saw that people were just justifying this day in and day out. And these were not oftentimes very good people, decent, thoughtful people. And yet it felt to me like there was some kind of filter, some kind of wall that was keeping people from actually genuinely seeing what was happening or feeling what was actually happening. And I wanted to try to interrogate the stories that I kept on hearing people tell about what it means to be Jewish, that I think have the effect of blinding us to these very painful and harsh realities about what the relationship between Israel and Palestinians actually is.
I mean, it's very interesting because, I mean, you write about, I guess, because I was going to talk about some other examples of this, which I think are quite striking. It's not specific, but, when we talk about victimhood and trauma, because obviously the Jewish people have been for 2,000 years victims of terrible persecution, culminating within living memory, of course, with the Shoah. But and as you know in the book, there's still fewer Jews alive globally now than there were before the Holocaust.
Right.
But you also challenge that, and that that's a very sensitive and thorny topic. And it's something even me talking about this with you, I feel kind of worried about how I phrase it. I'm concerned about how I phrase it. Do you just want to discuss what you mean in terms of that narrative that I suppose a lot of Jewish people are brought up with?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, obviously, that our people have endured a tremendous amount of oppression and trauma, and yet we're just also a group of human beings, right? So all human beings have the capacity to have the full range of human experiences, right? To be victims and also to be victimizers, depending on the circumstance, right? And we know from own personal experience that there's nothing about being a victim that means that you or your children or grandchildren cannot turn out to be victimizers. In fact, often one finds tragically in families, right, that actually people often end up repeating the trauma that was imposed on them on others. So, and in fact, one of the points I try to make is that Jewish tradition describes Jews in this whole range of different ways, right? So I start by talking about the book of Esther, which Jews read on the holiday of Purim, which we tend to discuss in the United States, generally think about as a story of Jewish victimhood and survival and an attempted genocide that Jews survived. But the story is much more complex than that, because it actually ends with a massacre by Jews of the Jewish adversaries, right? Because our texts understand that Jews are capable of this full range of different behavior. And so to me, the problem of having this template, which sees Jews as kind of history's permanent righteous victims, is that it blinds us to some very important realities that exist in Israel-Palestine, right? So if you say what happened on October 7th was horrifying, it was a targeted attack on civilians. But if you call it a pogrom, which was the term that was immediately used in much of Jewish spaces about this, then you essentially are suggesting that the conditions for Jews in Israel and Palestine in 2023 are similar to the conditions of Jews in the Russian Empire in the early 20th century, right? Which is fundamentally wrong, because you can't understand pogroms in the Russian Empire without understanding that Jews were legally inferior, right? That Jews were a subjugated class. Jews are not a subjugated class in Israel-Palestine. It's the reverse. Jews enjoy legal supremacy. And unless you understand that, you're not going to be able to understand October 7th, and you're not going to understand how to make sure it doesn't happen again. And you're not going to understand how to create a more peaceful and just reality for Israel and Palestinians. If you imagine Palestinians as the reincarnation of the pogromists of the Tsarist Empire, or of Hitler, or of Amalek, you essentially strip them of their humanity, and you strip them of the actual context that exists in that place.
Because what you talk about is actually comparisons with basically various forms of anti-colonial violence, which have themselves, people think maybe they'll think back anti-colonial violence and they might think it's just killing soldiers or the rest, but that's not true. Anti-colonial violence has actually had some ugly manifestations throughout history. So you're making that comparison rather than the comparisons with the pogroms of, for example, Tsarist Russia.
Yes, I think for Americans, one way of thinking about Gaza is by imagining the relationship between the United States and Native Americans in the 19th century, that Native Americans had been pushed off of their land and were being crowded into these smaller and smaller reservations, right? And in the case of Gaza, most of the people in Gaza, are not from Gaza. There are people who were expelled from what's now Israel in 1948. It's part of the reason the place is so overcrowded. They've been under blockade. They broke out, and in a very inhumane way, these Hamas fighters killed and abducted soldiers, but also a lot of civilians. That happened in the United States in the 19th century all the time, that Native Americans would attack American settlers in what's now the Midwest or the West of the United States, and they didn't distinguish very often between soldiers and non-combatants. They killed men, women, and children. It was horrifying. And I'm not saying it's not horrifying. What I'm saying is, one has to understand the context of the oppression in which this inhumane resistance takes place if one wants to create a safer, more peaceful environment for everybody.
What a comparison I want to put to you, and look, these comparisons are problematic by definition because there's lots of differences. But for me, it's Serb nationalism in the 1990s often comes to mind. I was in Belgrade last year in August, interviewing Russian dissidents. They often go to Belgrade.
Yes.
And one of them pointed out to me that recently the UN they passed a resolution about Srebrenica being genocide. And the main tower in Belgrade, they put a big rotating neon sign, "We're not a genocidal people." And the Serbs have suffered terrible horrors. They suffered genocide in World War II. They were the victims of genocide.
Yes.
And that sense of victimhood was very much key, an integral part of Serb nationalism in the 1990s.
Yes.
And in that ethnic cleansing was often justified partly on, with the Croats, etc. They're the heirs. They spoke. They glorified the Ustashi, who the Nazis thought went too far.
Yes.
But also, they suffered atrocities as well.
Yes.
And including children. In fact, I think the first massacre in Bosnia was of Serbs.
Yes.
But also, they justified ethnic cleansing on the basis of we used to be a majority in these areas, but then we suffered genocide, so we have a right to claim to it.
Yes.
Do you see what I mean? Because actually there was some, Ariel Sharon, the former prime minister himself, was very sympathetic to Serb nationalism.
Yes.
Do you see the parallel I'm making?
No, I think it's a really, interesting point. And I think it's not there. I think that it's important to remember that although the Jewish case of historic persecution and oppression is a very extreme one, right? that that it's not uncommon for groups to justify their oppression of other people by referring back to their past victimhood, genuine past victimhood, as you say, in the case of Serbs, or one of the cases that I talk about in the book is the case of Afrikaners, right?
Yeah.
We tend not to think about this, but Afrikaners had a very, very profound victimhood story of literally of concentration camps in the Boer War that was very central to their sense of who they were, their sense of being imperiled, right? And so it's important to remember that there can be elements of truth in this story, right? But that oftentimes what these stories do is they disregard the humanity of the people that you are oppressing today, because they turn them into the kind of reincarnation of the monsters of your collective past, and that prevents you from seeing them for who they are, for a group of human beings, right, who deserve to be treated with dignity. And it also creates this sense of fear. There are realistic levels of fear, right, but then there's also kind of I think a kind of their discourses of fear that basically give you the excuse to no longer have to operate within moral constraints, and that's what's very dangerous.
I mean, that point there, in terms of, for example, if you look at 7th October, or indeed any forms of violence towards, whether it be obviously the Israeli military, but the occupying forces, or civilians, it's framed as this show, it's anti-Semitism, the hatred of Jews. But if the Palestinians had suffered that dispossession, mass ethnic cleansing, violent ethnic cleansing, obviously driven from their homes in 1948, and the occupation by anyone, so if it had been Sikhs, for example, it would be the same outcome. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? And you would get maybe some, that people would be, a state saying, we represent the Sikhs, this is the Sikh state, and we represent Sikhness. Do you see what I mean? It would, but that's not, that's what's erased from this.
Right. No, that's exactly right. Palestinians, make this point all the time, right? That it's not that Palestinians don't recognize, or most Palestinians are not aware of the story of Jewish oppression in Europe, right? But essentially to say that for us, the relevant point, right, is that there was a movement that was born in Europe that came to the Middle East, notwithstanding the fact that Jews obviously have deep ties to the land, but the Zionist movement was a European movement which dispossessed Palestinians of their land and then made them second-class citizens and non-citizens under military law. And if that had been the French doing that, or the British, or the Portuguese, or whoever, right, that people would have resisted that, because in fact they did in those situations too, right? I mean, the Mau Mau rebellion, right, in which white farmers in Kenya were massacred with their families, wasn't because of the Kikuyu were anti-British racists. It was a particular response to their dispossession, right? Now I think there are better and worse responses to dispossession, and I think October 7th was a particularly unethical one, but it's not unusual if one thinks about the way in which people tend to resist their own violent dispossession.
I mean, I wonder what you think if I made the comparison with Rwanda, because in that context, the civil war began because the Tutsi rebel army, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, invaded from Uganda. I would say committed numerous atrocities. Hutu extremists responded by saying they're going to commit genocide against us. And the Rwandan Patriotic Front did commit terrible atrocities. And the reason I bring that up is because obviously, to be clear, the Tutsis were the victims of a hideous genocide. Every genocide is very different. But the Holocaust for people is normally the only reference point for genocides. It's quite unique in a sense, because there wasn't a organized Jewish militant force which was fighting Germany. It didn't exist. They had to make up, well, it's the Bolsheviks, they're Jewish, that's why they're an armed force. So, but do you see what I mean? It's that the Holocaust is actually when people think genocide, they think Holocaust, don't they? But actually many genocides take place within the context
of war,
an armed conflict, where where not only one force has a monopoly on atrocities, but there is a dynamic, and that's what's important.
Yes, no, I think that's a very important point. And it's actually, what's interesting is the United States government is actually willing to apply the term genocide to other things that are not that much like the Holocaust, right? So on the one hand, when it comes to talking about Gaza, there's this kind of response that you often hear this say, how could you call it a genocide? It's not the Holocaust. They haven't killed 2/3 of the people of Gaza. They're not. But in fact, the United States government just declared what's happening in Sudan to be a genocide. It doesn't look that much like the Holocaust. The United States said that what's happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang is a genocide. Nobody is suggesting, as far as I know, that China has killed all the Uyghurs or even trying to kill all the Uyghurs. A lot of the claim of genocide, and I'm not saying the claim is wrong, by the way. A lot of the claim is basically that Uyghurs were put in these kind of concentration camps where they couldn't practice their religion. There was forced re-education. They were separated from their children. There was torture, right? So actually, when it comes to countries and movements that the United States doesn't have a connection to, the United States actually willing to use the term genocide in a more, you could say, in a more capacious way and reading the letter of international law. But in this case, because it's Israel's America's ally, and of course also for Jews, because many Jews feel this intimate connection to Israel, there's this sense that this could not possibly be genocide, and yet Israel has destroyed the conditions of life in Gaza. When you destroy most of the buildings and the hospitals and the universities and the agriculture, you are basically making it, not everyone is going to die right away, right? But you're making it impossible for people to have actually the basic necessities of life. And what's even more terrifying to me is there's really no prospect of rebuilding in which this would be possible, right? What looks like is going to happen is that people in Gaza are going to be forced into an even smaller area of the Gaza Strip with an even tighter blockade.
83% of all plant life destroyed in Gaza, just as one particular example. So the ability to just produce food and sustain life,
absolutely
annihilated. I'm just interested. So the point you made there, and it's a really important point earlier on, is that you and I have seen over and over again this just, thanks to the work of often Palestinian journalists who've suffered butchery, often butchered alongside their children, but just unspeakable horror. I mean, we've seen Gaza. They said they were going to wipe Gaza off the face of the earth. They did. And that's the point as well. When I interviewed Raz Segal, the Israeli-American associate professor of genocide and Holocaust studies, he said it's rare for intent, to be spoken from the beginning. Human animals, and you wanted hell, you'll get hell, etc., etc. Gaza will be a city of 10. They just said what they were going to do and then did it. The Israeli state, the mass destruction of most civilian infrastructure, destruction of hospitals, as torture, rape. I mean, overwhelming evidence of sexual violence, including filmed gang rape of a detainee, and riots in support of the right to sexually assault Palestinian detainees. What's happened to over 1,000 over 1,000 Palestinian babies reported killed. I mean, you look at that and think, how can anyone not look at that and see? Because sometimes people think they're going mad. They think they're going mad because they think, how can the whole world not be screaming at this unspeakable horror? But how people turn off their human empathy, because only 2% of people are sociopaths. And you look at that in this book, and I'm just, can you just flesh that out? How people can possibly see this and just not feel that?
I mean, look, this is a human dynamic, right? And I'm as guilty of it as anybody else. I mean, I go through my day all the time. I walk through New York City. I see people lying on the street. I might give them $1, but am I tortured about it? Am I unable to sleep at night? Am I unable to sleep because I think about what's being done in factory farms in the United States or America's horrifying prison system? I mean, all of us, very much including myself, have the capacity to shut these things off. But I think that one of the ways that people do that is that we tell ourselves stories, right? And I think that what my book wanted to do was interrogate the kind of mainstream communal Jewish story that allows people to not see and feel, right? And it has to do with the idea, for instance, that basically that Palestinians or Hamas did this to themselves because they are using civilians as human shields. So if a hospital is destroyed or a university is destroyed, it's not really Israel to blame because these places are being used as human shields, for instance. And one of the points I try to make is that actually virtually every army that destroys civilian infrastructure makes the same argument about human shields, that the Russians literally, when they went into Kiev, they said the Ukrainians are using the population as human shields. People say that Hamas has created this network of tunnels, so therefore they are responsible for the destruction because they're living underground in these tunnels and exposing the civilians above board. Well, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese built a massive system of tunnels because they were also facing a very powerful air force that was dropping bombs on them. And the United States dropped these leaflets to the civilians saying, they're using you as human shields, right? This human shield, if you took the human shield argument seriously, you would also say that Palestinians have the right to bomb downtown Tel Aviv because the Israeli military is headquartered right in the center of the city, surrounded by schools and all kinds of civilian infrastructure. The argument kind of starts to fall apart when one actually puts any pressure on it, which is why, to me, it's less of an argument and more of a kind of a defense mechanism, a thing that you can say so you don't have to see and you don't have to feel the horror that you've just been describing.
It's interesting. I've just been writing about Guernica. And Guernica wasn't actually, well, it was one of the first mass aerial bombardments of a civilian community. And that was in the Spanish Civil War. And that was done by the Nazi and Italian fascist air forces. But they claimed it was, they blamed rebels and they said they dynamited it themselves. I mean, there's always this kind of, they did it, it wasn't us, they did it, yes. They did it. And that was true in the first mass civilian aerial bombardment of a civilian community. Yeah. I mean, but when we talk about the American Jewish community, I mean, don't you think it's quite interesting actually that, because there are about as many Jewish Americans as there are Jewish Israelis.
Yeah.
I mean, they're the two biggest Jewish communities on earth. They are diverging, I would say, quite strikingly.
Yes.
And actually the polling at middle of last year, by a right-wing think tank, I should say, found that 30% of Jewish Americans thought Israel is committing genocide. 40% of Jewish Americans under the age of 45 thought that Israel is committing genocide. That strikes me as interesting.
Yes, there is, a really dramatic generational gap among American Jews when it comes to Israel. And I think that the organized American Jewish community's support for Israel, and I think this is true for other diaspora communities as well, has always had a certain kind of intellectual contradiction at its heart, because most diaspora Jewish communities are very invested in the notion of equality under the law and non-sectarian, non-religious states, whether they live in the United States or Canada, Australia, Britain, France, whatever, right? And fight for those things and really fear ethno-nationalism, right? Most American Jews fear ethno-nationalism. I mean, there's a small group that is aligned with Trump, but most fear ethno-nationalism because as a small minority group, we understand that a Christian nation is threatening to us, right? And yet, particularly since 1967, the organized American Jewish community has been very emphatically supportive of the ethno-nationalist project in Israel of a Jewish state, which is specifically organized to privilege members of one ethno-religious group. And I think one thing that has become clear in the Trump era is that it's very difficult to actually effectively fight against ethno-nationalism in the United States if you're supporting ethno-nationalism in Israel, because we face now a global alliance of ethno-nationalists, right, all across the world, who basically believe that every country should be run by one tribe and that everybody else in that country is a kind of a guest in that country who better be on their best behavior because they're not really a member of that country, right? And I think in the Trump era, this contradiction has become clearer to people, which is part of the reason that you see more American Jewish criticism. But unfortunately, the folks with power in the organized American Jewish community tend to still be the ones who are very unconditionally supportive of Israel.
I mean, it's quite interesting, that point, because I mean, pre-war anti-Semitism, there were lots of tropes, but one of the reasons that we saw with the Nazis, the hatred of Jews was zoned in on their overrepresentation on the left. I mean, the left, as we know it today, wouldn't exist in its form without the contribution of Jewish people throughout history and different strains of them. And that was partly, they were called rootless cosmopolitans because they were drawn to the internationalism of the left because they saw nationalism, understandably, as a threat to them. I mean, that's the point, is that Israel has kind of shifted, because Israel's response was, no. The problem isn't ethno-nationalism, the problem is we didn't have our ethno-nationalism.
Yes. That's exactly right, and there were even some Herzl himself, right? Some early Zionists had themselves been liberals of a certain sort, right? Who believed in kind of universalist liberalism, and then basically said, well, that's not going to work, so we need our own form of nationalism or ethno-nationalism. The problem with this. The problem with that idea is that I think it fails even on its own terms, in the sense that the whole even if you didn't care at all about Palestinians, right, and you only judged Israel based on the metric of Jewish safety, and you said, well, we need Jewish supremacy because that's what keeps Jews safe. Well, actually Jews are more safe in diaspora countries, right, which are making some effort to have political systems based on equality under the law, than they are in Israel, because a system of legal supremacy imposes tremendous violence on people who are legally inferior. And that violence makes life more dangerous for everybody. Societies tend to be more peaceful when everyone has a voice in government.
I mean, Joe Biden last July said if there weren't an Israel, every Jew in the world would be at risk.
Right. I mean, it was a very bizarre statement to make, right? Since he's a president who has an obligation to protect all of his citizens, including American including Jewish citizens. And the truth is that Jews have fared. You talked about the history of Jews on the left. There's obviously a lot of tragedy in these stories, because leftist movements have sometimes failed, and not times only failed, but sometimes taken powers in the Soviet Union and not lived up and kind of betrayed their own promises, right? But it's also true that I think if you think about the shift in Jewish fortunes in the 20th century, from the hell of the mid 20th century to where Jews are now, the single biggest reason that Jews are more safe is because most Jews live in liberal democracies, right? And our safety is absolutely bound up with the survival of liberal democracy. And yes, there are a lot of Jews who live in Israel as a Jewish state, but as I say, they actually tend to be the community of Jews that is in most danger, that is most traumatized by violence, right? A Palestinian friend of mine told me once that he was walking in a Jewish suburb of Atlanta, and he saw a group of Orthodox Jews walking down the street. And he said, it was so striking to me, Peter, to see them, because they looked similar to the settlers that I see, but none of them were carrying guns. Right. Mm-hmm. And he thought to himself, why are they not carrying guns? And he said, the reason they're not carrying guns is because they don't live cheek by jowl with a group of people who are being denied basic human rights. And so they're not afraid. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really, really key insight about the relationship between oppression and fear.
Let's talk about idolatry and the relationship. You talk about, you write about idolatry in Jewish theology and the relationship between organized Jews as a community and Israel. Just talk a bit more about that.
Sure. So, as you know, one of the lines that's very, very frequently used in this conversation to kind of regulate who gets to be a legitimate member of the discourse about Israel and Palestine is whether you acknowledge Israel's right to exist. It's kind of like the ante you need to put in at the poker table in order to have a seat at the table, right? But my book tries to argue is that actually in Jewish tradition, right, there is no right for states to exist. And Yeshayahu Leibovitz, the Orthodox Israeli social critic, who's really a hero of mine, said that a state is not a value, that in Jewish tradition, it's human beings that are created in the image of God, and states are instruments to protect human life, and they can also crush human life, and they should be evaluated based on the impact they have on the people who live within their control. And if they're doing a really, really bad job of protecting people's lives and allowing people to flourish, then we should think about reimagining the nature of that state, right? Which is something we kind of do all the time, right? Apartheid South Africa was a different kind of state was imagined. There are lots of people in Washington who would like Iran and Cuba and China and Venezuela to be different kinds of, Russia to be different kinds of states, right? So what's so perverse to me about this debate about right to exist is that it says that Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state is unconditional, but the rights of Palestinians in Gaza to exist, that's negotiable, right? And that to me is idolatry, because anything that suggests that anything that you elevate above the human being, anything that you say is sacrosanct, is you are treating it as an idol. And the essence of idolatry is that nothing should be worshipped except for God, whether that's an idol or a statue or a star or indeed a state.
Just a couple of final things. That's a really fascinating point, of course, but, which is about the use of anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is very real and rising, and, is responsible for so many terrible crimes, including, of course, the Holocaust, which remains within living memory. The use of anti-Semitism, how the irresponsibility of its use when it's about, stigmatizing forms of solidarity with the Palestinian people, and where we have Elon Musk, the most powerful member of the court of Trump, without getting to debate about whether he did a full-on Nazi salute repeatedly, but about, you know, Twitter just being a mass, just being dominated by neo-Nazis who he actually has signal boosted, for example. What do you think about this whole discourse and how the danger of this discourse?
I mean, I think that the most important thing to remember is that anti-Semitism is a form of bigotry, and bigotry is wrong because it denies human equality, right? So the struggle against anti-Semitism, like the struggle against all bigotry, is at base a struggle to treat people equally, right? So if you are then using the language of anti-Semitism, the language of anti-bigotry, as a way of shielding a state from criticism, when that state maintains two legal systems, right? One for Jews and one for Palestinians, which is the reason it's been called an apartheid state by its own leading human rights organizations, it's utterly morally perverse because you're using the language of anti-bigotry to justify a system of bigotry. Anti-Semitism has particular features like all bigotries, but according to the research that I have looked at, you can't look at groups like the ADL, which are Israel advocacy organizations. But if you look at academics who actually study anti-Semitic attitudes, what you find is that people who are anti-Semitic tend to also be bigoted against other groups, that these bigotries tend to travel together, that the people who tend to dislike Jews also tend to dislike Muslims in the United States and Europe. They also tend to dislike LGBT people and immigrants and Black people. And the struggle against these bigotries must be made in unison, right? But you can't do that if you have basically said that the struggle against anti-Semitism is going to be the defense of a state. States are self-interested actors who deserve criticism, right? You're not an anti-Black racist if you criticize Nigeria. You're not an anti-Asian racist if you criticize the People's Republic of China, right? So why on earth would you be anti-Semitic because you criticize the state of Israel for its human rights abuses?
I mean, it is striking. You'll sometimes get some of the most far-right and racist politicians being extremely racist and then condemning their opponents as anti-Semitic, and also using that to, for example, justify Islamophobia, i.e. they are anti-Semitic. I mean, it's quite. I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? Because you know, these are people who just be completely gratuitously racist, but then use anti-Semitism in a particular way, and they're clearly looking at Israel as a kind of something to emulate. I mean, they're
absolutely
looking at
right, and the media, at least in the United States, seems to often have trouble understanding why someone could love Israel and yet be quite hostile to the Jews in their own country, right? Whether it's Viktor Orban or many others. But it's not hard to
Richard Nixon,
right.
Pro-Israel, very anti-Semitic.
It's not hard to understand at all, right? The far right loves Israel because they love the idea of legal hierarchy. They like the idea that states should have one set of laws for people who are the real owners of that state, right? And then another set of laws for everybody else. They're ethno-nationalists, right? And so they see Israel as a very shining example of what an ethno-nationalist state looks like. That's what they want. But that very ethno-nationalism often leads them to have a big problem with Jews in their own country, because Jews in their own country are an ethnic and religious minority who have an annoying habit of allying themselves with other members of historically discriminated groups to fight for equality under the law against white Christian supremacy, right? And so their basic view is, you should go live in Israel, which is your country, and stop messing around with things in our country, which we want to be a white Christian country, right? So it's quite coherent, this anti-Semitic pro-Israel politics.
Just finally, because you talk about South Africa, a fair bit, and you have South African heritage. So just finally, I mean, Nelson Mandela famously said, it always seems impossible until it's done. But, you know, and you wrote about how the white South Africans, you know, the polling showed they overwhelmingly feared Black self-government. Apartheid as well. People just look back and, you know, think it presents itself as, wahaha, we hate Black people. But they didn't. They created a story. They're like, oh, what? It's separate development. What's wrong with that? Come on, we just want people to have do their own thing. I mean, the prospect, people look at any possible, you know, if I think of a single democratic state with equality for all, which is my magic one solution, it looks so far-fetched. So what's your answer?
Well, look, it may be that this doesn't come to be. You know, Ta-Nehisi Coates has a line about American history who says oftentimes American history is a story of things just not working out. He talks about all the people who struggled for justice in the United States and failed and were even forgotten. It may be horrifyingly that the story of the Palestinians ends up being that Israel has an American-style solution to that, by which I mean the 19th century American solution to Native Americans, and Palestinians over the course of decades and generations are simply destroyed as a people, so they can't function politically anymore, even if there's still some of them around. But we have to resist that with all of our being, because it's just profoundly wrong. And for me, as an observant Jew, it profoundly violates the core notion that all human beings are created in the image of God and all human beings are of infinite value. And if I take from what I take hope from is the movement that is emerging around the world, which brings together people of every different background, in support of the very basic principle that Palestinians deserve to be treated like human beings and they deserve to be free. And this movement does have some of the same characteristics of the great moral movements of the 20th century. It's up against very, very powerful forces, and yet we have seen that these movements can do things that seem impossible. Very few South Africans, white or black, thought that apartheid would end even as late as the 1980s, and it ended in 1994, right? Very few Americans in the middle of the 20th century thought that we would have a military or white soldiers were taking off orders from black officers, and yet a generation later we did it. And that was because of the struggle of great movements that had a vision and where people were willing to put themselves on the line. So that's what gives me hope.
Well, that's an optimistic place to end. And at a time of terrible darkness, always looking for hope. Everyone do check out Being Jewish after the destruction of Gaza. You can also cover it in T to show you've engaged with the material as best as possible. But it's a searing read with humanity. It's very cool. You know, the idea of every person a universe. And so press like, subscribe, share the video, leave your comments. All good for engagement to get the message across, because more people will watch the video and listen, which is the whole point. Peter, thanks so much.
Thank you, Owen. I really enjoyed it.